Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're doing our first deep dive into a game I've been excited for since its announcement last year, Humankind. Coming to us from Amplitude Studios, developers of Endless Space and Endless Legend, Humankind is a historical 4X game where you lead a nomadic tribe from the Bronze Age onwards. One of the biggest differentiators in Humankind is that you build your own culture as you go, blending parts from different real-world cultures, picking and choosing what fits your needs, and then seeing that reflected in the options it opens up for you, as well as your people's aesthetics. That cultural element is what I want to focus on in this video. The developers have just recently finished revealing all of the Bronze Age civilizations, and I wanted to go over them with just a touch of historical context for each. This is very different from my usual type of video, so let me know your thoughts below. Feedback, positive and constructive, is always welcome here, and I'd love to do more videos like this for other historical titles, as well as with future coverage of Humankind too. With all that said, there's no time to waste, so let's get started. The Bronze Age spanned from approximately mid-4th millennium BC to the start of the 1st millennium BC, though it started and ended at different portions of that time span, depending on where in the world you're looking. Characterized by the use of bronze, if the name didn't give it away, in some parts of the world, the Bronze Age brought urbanization and early forms of writing as well. It preceded the Iron Age, and it looks like Humankind is blending the Bronze and Iron Ages into one, as the one that follows in-game is the Classical era. As you can imagine, there are quite a few cultures that came into prominence in this time period. 10 are set to be represented in Humankind, at least at launch. The Egyptians are among the oldest civilizations we know of. The rich and fertile Nile Valley allowed many civilizations to thrive off the annual flooding of the river, and from around 5500 BC onwards, tribes started to settle down in the area, and sometime around 3300 BC, a more unified culture started forming. The two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, named based on the flow of the Nile, not their latitude, eventually united around 3150 BC, and I assume this united Egypt is who we play as when we start as the Egyptians. In Humankind, the Egyptians are classified as builders, with the pyramids being a key quarter and the Markabat being the key unit. Markabat, which I am sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of, simply translate to vehicle, if I'm not mistaken, in modern-day Arabic, and here it's being used to represent the chariot with presumably ranged capabilities, as that's how a lot of Egyptian chariots were used in battle. The Egyptian Bronze Age continued until about 1200 BC, when the Iron Age took over. Naturally, Egypt has had a long and interesting story since then, with Greek, Roman, Arab, and European conquerors, but the influence of this ancient civilization can still be seen today. Fun fact, we're actually closer to the Roman conquest of Egypt than they were to the construction of the pyramids. Maybe that puts their age into perspective. The Harappan civilization bloomed out of the Indus Valley right at the border of present-day India and Pakistan, expanding throughout most of Pakistan and into parts of northwest India at its height. Though the civilization can be dated back to about the same time frame as ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization timeline is split into early and mature, with the transition being kicked off by the building of massive urban centers. This transition may have been the result of reduced rainfall in the region over multiple centuries, forcing the creation of urban centers. Reliance on annual flooding of the rivers meant development was determined by the location of said flooding. Unfortunately, this trend of reduced rainfall ultimately led to the demise of the civilization, and its inhabitants migrated eastwards into India. The Indus Valley civilization cities were known for their grid-based urban planning and were home to the world's first known sanitation system, including public baths, sewage, and drainage. A high priority on hygiene and access to water meant houses often had individual wells and separate rooms for bathing. From what we know, the Indus Valley civilization wasn't one of war, but instead craftsmanship and trade. Cities had giant walls likely to prevent flooding, but these same walls may have deterred war. Now in Humankind, the Harappans are an agrarian people with a canal network and a runner unit. I'm curious to see what the latter does especially. Fun fact, the Harappan script is still undeciphered. We don't even know for sure if it's a linguistic script or not. Assyria was a Mesopotamian kingdom that was born out of a Sumerian city-state, Assur, established around 2600 BC. Akkadian conquest followed, with the first Assyrian king recorded around 2450 BC. The old Assyrian Empire came and went multiple times through multiple overlords, and it wasn't until around 1392 BC that Assyria started to establish itself as a bit of a power in the region. The kingdom went on to last until around the middle of the first millennium BC, but that goes a little beyond the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, and Assyria was actually not as poorly affected by the Bronze Age collapse from 1200 to 936 BC. A lot of other Bronze Age nations and civilizations in the area saw massive depopulation and massive deurbanization in this time frame, but Assyria somehow managed to pull through. They'd seen multiple long wars, and as such, they developed a warrior society, with the king dependent on citizens, priests, and landed nobility in times of war, especially the landed nobles who supplied horses for use in battle. The military was a core part of the kingdom. In fact, it's possible that the Assyrians had one of the earliest examples of a permanent standing professional army, with all free male citizens obliged to serve in the army for a period of time. Assyria didn't need as intricate an irrigation system, and as such was able to devote more resources to horse breeding, and it also was able to trade metal ore from the mountains in the area, as well as lumber. In the game, the Assyrians are classified as expansionist, a good reflection of their height in 671 BC when they held much of the Middle East and crossed over to conquer Egypt as well. The Assyrian raiders are the emblematic unit here, though the reference to Shalmaneser III is curious considering he was an Iron Age king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So again, we can see Humankind is blending the Bronze Age start with the Iron Age supremacy of the Assyrians. Meanwhile, the Dunnu acts as the emblematic quarter, a fortified unit of rural habitation primarily used for farming, but possibly used for more military purposes as well, such as the provisioning of horses and chariots and the policing of newly conquered areas. Here's a fun fact: Assyria derives its name from that first city-state of Assur, named after its patron deity Ashur, who was the head of the Assyrian pantheon. The Phoenicians are a very interesting inclusion in Humankind. Originating from the western parts of the Fertile Crescent around modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians were merchants and colonizers going far across the Mediterranean, responsible for the foundation of important cities such as Cadiz around 1100 BC and Carthage around 814 BC, though the latter was during the Iron Age, of course, again being blended into this Bronze Age era. By about 1050 BC, the Phoenician alphabet became one of the most widely used writing systems spread by the very same merchants and colonizers. The highest point of the Phoenician culture sits around 1200 to 800 BC, and the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age falls right around the start of that. The conquest by Persian King Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, well after the end of the Bronze Age, is what ultimately brought an end to Phoenicia. The Phoenician people originally showed solidarity with their former colonies like Carthage, and eventually they were responsible for leaving some remarkable monuments behind, like the Xerxes Canal that was built by Phoenicians under the Persian king Xerxes I. Herodotus even considered Phoenicians to be the best sailors in the Persian fleet. Ultimately, when Macedonian king Alexander the Great came through in 332 BC, Macedonian rule wiped out former Phoenician dominance over Mediterranean trade routes, and that was that. In Humankind, the Phoenicians are fittingly referred to as merchants, with biremes as their emblematic unit and havens as their emblematic quarters. Here's a fun fact: the Phoenician writing system eventually gave rise to the Greek alphabet, which in turn gave rise to the Latin alphabet, so there's a legacy that's still active to date. Nubia came to prominence around 2500 BC and, in some senses, lasted until about 1500 BC when the new kingdom of Egypt conquered them. Known as the Land of the Bow, or Ta Seti by the Egyptians, the Nubians were considered expert archers, and prior to the conquest I mentioned earlier, Egyptians and Nubians were trade partners, trading culture and goods, including ivory, gold, incense, and ebony. Eventually, Egypt started asserting territorial control in northern Nubia, but the people and the culture survived for centuries to come, resurfacing in the Iron Age with the Kingdom of Kush, a Nubian kingdom that, in turn, conquered Egypt. Many Egyptian pharaohs of this time period were of Nubian origin, even though they ruled similar to how the Egyptian pharaohs before them did. Nubians still live in present-day Egypt and Sudan. The Nubians are marked as a merchant culture as well, reflecting their strong history of trade between North and tropical Africa, but they have access to Ta-Seti archers to reflect their skill with the bow. These pyramids are perhaps not as famous as Egyptian pyramids, but more than 35 have been found in present-day Sudan, with the Meroe pyramids being the most extensive Nubian pyramid site. These pyramids have a very different shape to Egyptian pyramids, with much steeper angles and a much smaller base for equivalent heights. The pyramids are the emblematic quarter for Nubia, and fun fact, the Magi, who are actually referenced in the Mummy movie, were actually people from the Nubia region who worked in the Egyptian military as mercenaries. Eventually, they became an elite paramilitary police force, and they were responsible for protecting valuable areas such as the royal palaces and tombs in Thebes, and perhaps, the tomb of Imhotep as per the movie. So pretty interesting to see the Magi represented in relatively recent popular culture as well. They're actually Nubian though, not Egyptian. The Babylonians arose from the small Akkadian town of Babylon, replacing the Akkadian Empire as one of the major powers in the region from about 1895 BC in the Bronze Age, right about 539 BC in the Iron Age, when they were conquered by the First Persian Empire. Often competing with Assyria, Babylonia briefly became the major power in the region around 1700 or so BC under the rule of Hammurabi. Hammurabi expanded Babylon from a small town into a great city, establishing a proper form of bureaucracy with taxation and centralized government. He freed Babylon from under the control of Elam, another local power, and proceeded to conquer southern Mesopotamia, entering a protracted war with the old Assyrian Empire. Hammurabi made Babylon the cultural and religious center of southern Mesopotamia, and the once small town became a holy city where any legitimate ruler of southern Mesopotamia had to be crowned. Unfortunately, the death of Hammurabi led to the rapid disintegration of what he had built. There was a resurgence of Babylonian culture in the Iron Age when their interests in the sciences, astronomy, and astrology shone through. Babylonian astronomy and astrology goes further back to about 1800 BC, but it was more formalized in this later era around 600 or so BC, and it was the basis for a lot of ancient Greek, Indian, Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European astronomy, and there were even Babylonian astronomers who supported the heliocentric model of planetary motion. Babylonians also developed the base 60 numeral system that we still use to date: 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They calculated the square root of 2 correctly to 7 places, and they demonstrated knowledge and awareness of the Pythagorean theorem well before Pythagoras. It should be no surprise then that the Babylonians are classified as scientists in Humankind, with an astronomy house as the emblematic quarter, and the unit is also potentially more of an Iron Age guardsman unit that worked in exchange for access to arable land. I'm honestly not exactly sure about the origin of this unit. Now, here's a fun fact though: the Code of Hammurabi was one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes with 282 edicts. Carved from a single 4-ton slab of diorite stone, the code included some harsh punishments and is the source of the concept of an eye for an eye when it comes to legal punishment. It's also one of the earliest examples of the concept of innocent until proven guilty. The Hittites were yet another Bronze Age powerhouse of the Middle East, rising to prominence around 1600 BC, but relatively quickly falling to Assyrians by about 1178 BC. They controlled much of Anatolia as well as the northern Levant and upper Mesopotamia at their height, fighting wars against the Assyrians as well as the Egyptians. It's suspected that the Hittites actually originated from present-day Ukraine, arriving in Anatolia in the Bronze Age and imposing their own culture on the locals either by means of conquest or assimilation. Their origins are somewhat disputed, but it's almost certain that they aren't local to the region. Hittite prosperity was the result of control over trade routes and metal sources in the area, so they often fought wars to maintain this control, building fortifications at crucial junctions where needed. Supposedly, Hittite rulers were among the earliest known pioneers of diplomacy, often partaking in conducting treaties and alliances with neighboring nations, and evidently when diplomacy didn't go well, they just conquered them. In Humankind, the Hittites are marked as warmongers to represent their expansionist nature, with the Awari fortification acting as an emblematic quarter. Awari means field in Hurrian, though I've seen reference to it also meaning border fort. It sounds very similar to the Assyrian Dunnu, so I'm curious to see how these will actually differentiate from each other. The Sigir emblematic unit reflects the fact that Hittites were renowned charioteers, using a unique type of chariot that had lighter wheels using 4 spokes rather than the more common 8, and these wheels were placed in a more central location. This placement of the wheels allowed for 3 riders rather than 2, and of the 3 there was a driver, an archer, and finally a warrior who'd either wield a spear or sword or maybe hold up a shield. Strangely, the Sigir here is shown with only 2 riders, so not sure what that's about. Fun fact, the Hittites were some of the first people to use iron, and they are sometimes credited with spreading the initial use of iron. The Olmecs are the only non-Eurasian civilization we're seeing at launch in the Bronze Age, the earliest known major Mesoamerican civilization. Their origins have been placed around 1400 to 1200 BC, though earlier roots go as far back as 5100 BC with the farming cultures of Tabasco. The region was similar to the Nile, Indus, Yellow River, and Mesopotamian valleys, an extremely productive environment that resulted in densely concentrated populations. Densely concentrated populations that eventually developed a class system that drove the production of luxury goods made of jade, obsidian, and magnetite. These luxury goods are fairly emblematic of the Olmec culture, and they also imply an extensive trade network since many of these resources are not found locally. Jade and obsidian are both found in Guatemala, for example. We're not entirely sure why the Olmec culture eventually faded away, but it may have been the result of internal strife or perhaps environmental changes that made the area unsuitable for farming. Some theories even suggest volcanic eruptions may have forced the Olmec to move. As I said, the luxury goods of the Olmecs really represent their culture, and as such, the Olmecs are listed as aesthetes. Aesthetes? They're people who are into aesthetics. I've never been able to pronounce that word, but they have a special appreciation of art and beauty. The javelin throwers are their emblematic unit, but their emblematic quarter is the more interesting element. The most recognized aspect of the Olmec civilization are the colossal head sculptures. No 2 are alike, and the headdresses are decorated with distinct elements that suggest individuality. We've unearthed 17 to date, and they range from 3.4 to 1.47 meters high, and they weigh between 25 and 55 tons, carved from single blocks. Fun fact, the Olmecs played the Mesoamerican ball game, and though we don't know the exact rules of the original game, a more modern version of the game called Ulama is still played by the indigenous populations of Mesoamerica. The Mycenaeans are from the last phase of the Bronze Age in ancient Greece, spanning from around 1600 BC to about 1100 BC. They represent the first distinctly Greek civilization in mainland Greece, characterized by palatial states, urban organization, works of art, and writing systems. Mycenaean settlements also appear in Epirus, Macedonia, and on islands in the Aegean Sea, as well as on the coast of Asia Minor, the Levant, Cyprus, and Italy. The Mycenaeans introduced many innovations in the realms of engineering, architecture, and military infrastructure, and they also conducted trade across the Mediterranean. When the late Bronze Age collapse happened, transitioning into the Iron Age, Mycenaean Greece basically collapsed. The Greeks of classical antiquity looked back upon the Mycenaean period as an era of heroes, and the legends of Homer's epics were simply accepted as actual retellings of Greek history until the 19th century. Mycenaean engineering, as I said earlier, was very noteworthy. Bridges, culverts, aqueducts, dams, roads, and fortifications were of the type that were completely unmatched until later Roman works in the same fields. The Mycenaeans were well ahead of the curve compared to the other Bronze Age cultures of Europe. The system of military organization and the existence of a warrior elite society marries nicely with the classification as warmongers in Humankind, and the emblematic quarter of the Cyclopean fortress is a good reference to a type of stonework found in Mycenaean architecture. Cyclopean masonry involves the use of massive limestone boulders roughly fit together with minimal use of any sort of binding or adhesive agent, if any is used at all. The very walls of Mycenae are built in this way, and this style is characteristic of Mycenaean fortifications in general. The emblematic unit is the plural form of Promachus, translating roughly into who leads in battle, or perhaps champion. It is the name of many different people in Greek mythology and history, and typically points to a more well-equipped swordsman. Fun fact, one of the most common depictions of the Mycenaeans is their war against the Trojans of Asia Minor. The details of this war are very fuzzy, and some think the war may not even have happened, though there is evidence to suggest it did. Details like the Trojan horse, however, might just be entirely made up. The Zhou are an interesting pick for representing China at launch, coming into prominence around 1046 BC. They are really at the tail end of the Bronze Age. The real Bronze Age power in China was the Shang dynasty, who the Zhou replaced, but the Zhou were perhaps the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history, spanning 790 years. This is also the era when some of the best Chinese bronze works were made, and it's the time when the written script evolved to its near-modern form. Represented as aesthetes in the game, the emblematic quarter is the Confucian school, which is a representation of the popular teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius. The emblematic unit, meanwhile, is the Chinese war chariot, Zhanqi. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, I apologize. It literally translates into war vehicle. A crew of 3 atop a 2-wheeled vehicle drawn by 2 to 4 horses, these were extremely fast vehicles with massive wheels. The game, interestingly, suggests that it actually consisted of 2 riders, so I'm curious about this discrepancy. Another point of interest is that the Shang period and Zhou period chariots were distinct in their number of spokes, with the Zhou period chariots having 18 to 26 spokes. All that aside, the chariot was used in warfare until the early years of the Han dynasty from around 1200 to 200 BC, when it was replaced by cavalry and became more of a support unit. Fun fact, the Zhou rulers introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that the supreme god in heaven legitimizes the ruler. This concept of the mandate of heaven comes up many times in Chinese history, and it was often used as a means to keep the ruling parties in check. If the nation was falling under disarray, it could be said that the current ruling party had lost its mandate of heaven and as such must be removed from power. Going over these 10 cultures, it's pretty clear that though the first era is referred to as the Bronze Age, many of these cultures actually saw their true heights during the Iron Age. We know that the age to follow is the Classical era, so it seems the Iron Age and the Bronze Age will be blended into one for the purposes of technological advancements and cultural evolution. Humankind is taking a very interesting approach to cultural development through the ages, and I'm very excited to see how these initial choices might result in various permutations moving forward through time. Let me know your own thoughts on the 10 cultures we've seen. Are you happy with the selection? Do you wish any others were showcased? Do you already know which you'll be playing your first game as? I'm always curious to hear others' thoughts, so let me know. As I've said before, I'm very excited to cover Humankind on the channel, so if you'd like to keep up with coverage, make sure you subscribe. A massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis, and a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.